approximately 2 months after the preliminary statement that we issued after the election, is to return to release the final report, copies of which will be made available afterwards, which is our final analysis on the election and our conclusions on the election. And also, very importantly, and it's the thing I'll focus on mostly today, are our recommendations for the future. And these recommendations, which I'll talk about a little bit in a moment, are designed to improve the process for 2023, to address the shortcomings we identified in 2018, and to help build a more robust and credible process for elections in Zimbabwe. All our work, and I remember explaining this many, many times during our time here in Zimbabwe, all our analysis is based on relevant international and regional standards for elections. Our job was to assess the extent to which the elections were credible in terms of those international and regional standards. Likewise, the recommendations we offer are all in line with relevant regional and international standards. They're not plucking out ideas from thin air. They're saying, according to international standards, these are the sort of benchmarks countries should be aiming towards. And our recommendations are really geared towards helping Zimbabwe take steps in that direction. We believe they can help identify a number of the sort of key shortfalls that we identified. And I think what I would do for the purpose of the press conference is, the recommendations themselves cover all aspects of the election, from the legal framework, election administration, political parties and election campaign, voter registration, the conduct of the media, voting, counting, results, and the post-election environment. But for the purpose of this press conference, I think I'll focus on just some of our priority recommendations, and also try and group them into 4 sort of areas which I think will make more sense to people. These 4 areas are looking at the independence and the effectiveness of the election management body, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. That's one category. The second category is how to achieve a more level playing field and conducive environment for the elections. The third category will be the legal framework for the conduct of elections. And the fourth category is the inclusiveness of the process and the participation rights therein. With regards to how to increase the sort of confidence in the process in terms of the perception of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, we firstly believe it's very important to further strengthen the independence of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. It is created as an independent body, but for certain reasons in the law, there are certain sort of qualifications on that. For example, the role of the Ministry of Justice in overseeing the regulations of ZEC. We believe that independence could be further enhanced. Secondly, and this reflects our observations in the pre-election period, and I think it's one of the most critical findings, was ZEC's communication policy on the election. We believe that ZEC should provide a more effective and timely information during the election in order to enhance transparency and confidence. And this can affect a whole range of its work, from notification on its decisions to information on the voter roll, and also the breakdown of results after the election and presenting these in a more timely and transparent way. I think that all in all, this issue of communication and transparency of the Electoral Commission was a critical area. And finally is the results management process itself. We felt that the results lacked sort of verifiability and traceability, and this helped plug into the lack of confidence and the tension after the election as the result was challenged. That it took a long time for this result to be broken down and for the Electoral Commission to explain how the final result was ascertained. And this could involve elements such as publication of the original V11s or V23 forms and such things. The second sort of area I'll focus on is this issue of the level playing field and the conducive environment for the election. Firstly, one of our findings that we issued in our preliminary statement was very much about the bias that was shown in the state media coverage of the election, be it television or radio. State media is fundamentally important in the Zimbabwean context, given its monopoly of the radio and dominance of the TV sector and newspapers. So we feel state media must be more impartial in its coverage, and we've offered a number of recommendations on how this might be achieved. Also to liberalise the media environment and to provide licences for private media to be established, which is another sort of stumbling block at the moment. We believe that legal measures should also be introduced to mitigate the abuse of incumbency and the abuse of state resources during the election. While we acknowledge there's always an advantage of incumbency, there should be sort of clear lines so everyone understands where that advantage ends and where abuse starts, and particularly on state resources and such things. And this could involve the sort of limitations on the use of or the launching of aid programs during the election campaign, for example, and as well as other activities. Another issue that we would raise in terms of the environment for the election is we feel there need to be campaign finance regulations linked to the need for political parties to disclose their sources of funding, but also their expenditure during an election. This will help increase transparency and accountability in the political process, and can also be used as one way of helping to sort of minimise the abuse of state resources as well. We do recognise this is a challenge, and I think every country on the planet struggles with effective campaign finance regulations. But in Zimbabwe at the moment, I think there's a complete absence of such things in terms of disclosures, so we feel that steps could be taken in that regard. The final issue on to create a more level playing field is the constituency boundaries for the National Assembly elections. The Constitution says these should be a roughly equal size with no discrepancy beyond 20%, if my memory serves me right. There's massive discrepancies in the electoral constituencies in Zimbabwe, some quite pronounced ones, and this means that there is not equal suffrage for the election. So we feel to redraw the boundaries of the electoral constituencies in order to create them to be more of an equal size. The third category I mentioned was about the legal framework for the elections. We've got a number of issues, but I'll just focus on two here. One is that prior to the 2018 elections, there was an effort made to reform legislation generally to bring it more into line with the 2013 Constitution. But this wasn't finally achieved, and there remain areas where the electoral legislation could be further reformed to bring it into line with the Constitution. For example, about the right to vote and who this applies to, but also secondly in terms of the independence of the Electoral Commission again, and some other areas. The second issue under the legal framework is about the need to create appropriate time limits for the determination of pre-election disputes. We noted quite a number of court cases in the pre-election period where the court didn't reach a decision, but the decisions were deferred or the cases were deferred, so that justice was not done and rights were not protected prior to the election. We feel the establishment of sort of time limits for those election-related cases, much as there are for the petitions in the post-election period, could be helpful in order to ensure that all these cases are dealt with in a timely manner and the right to an effective legal remedy is properly provided for. In order to make the final category I talked about was inclusivity, and here I'll just talk about two issues. One is the voter registration. We feel that the voter registration was a major effort on behalf of the Electoral Commission, a brand new process of biometric registration, which created quite an inclusive list. But it's clear that there are still areas where further under-registration exists, particularly in the urban areas of Harare and Bulawayo, where the level of registration was approximately 65% of the eligible population, compared to about 80% in other parts of the country. So again, this means that universal suffrage and equal suffrage are not properly provided for. There is also some other sort of technical issues around voter registration, and I suspect ZEC, which is now undertaking its own review of the process, will reflect a lot on how it did voter registration and maybe learn its own lessons. But just one issue we focused on was how to properly identify voters to make sure everyone is satisfied that the person is who they say they are and that their address is properly captured so they can be allocated to the proper polling station, to avoid some of the debate and discrepancies around the voter roll that we identified for the election. The second and final issue on inclusivity is, and I mentioned it earlier, is the role of the multi-party liaison committees. These were created quite a long time, I think a couple of years before or a year before the elections. and we feel that these should be used, or could be a very positive tool for dialogue in the pre-election period, conflict resolution, but also as a means for the Electoral Commission to have a more productive relationship with political parties during the election period. So if these are held more often and in a more meaningful way, this could be another sort of effective, inclusive sort of tool in the lead up to the election. These recommendations are very much offered to support a sort of positive democratic direction in Zimbabwe. In our report, as we did in our preliminary statement, we focused quite strongly on many of the shortcomings that we found. And if you recall our preliminary statement, we were quite critical of many aspects of the election. And this continues in our final report, where we come to a sort of a final conclusion. But the spirit of election observation is very much one of partnership and sort of cooperation with regards to looking to the future. So we've tried with these recommendations to offer them as a way of moving the country forward and trying to stop some of the sort of recurring problems that may occur in the electoral process. But in order for that to be able to happen, it's fundamentally important for both the government and the opposition to pursue the democratic aspirations of the citizenry and to deliver the necessary reforms. Many of these require legislative change. Some of them are technical, some of them will be behavioural, but many of them are legislative. And so therefore the Parliament will need to be involved in this. And earlier we had a meeting with the Speaker of the Parliament and discussed some of this. And we're very much interested in encouraging political party dialogue and cooperation in the Parliament in order to move this reform process forward in the appropriate way. My experience around the world has shown me that with the right political will, you can achieve many things. With the lack of political will, it's very hard to achieve anything. So there does need to be the requisite political will on all sides of the equation. In conclusion, I would say, just reiterate really, that this return visit, which is the end of the role of the EU Election Observation Mission, when we leave on Wednesday, that will be the end of the EU mission. And in many regards then, the EU's engagement on the electoral process will pass back to the EU delegation. And my colleague Patrick here represents the EU delegation and is the current chargé d'affaires there. We would encourage a full discussion on these necessary reforms and encourage government, parliament, the electoral authorities, civil society and stakeholders to try to find ways forward. You know, we're not naive. We understand that the political environment is still very fractious and polarized. But you know, in the interest of moving the electoral process forward, somehow these issues will need to be addressed. So the shortcomings of the 2018 elections can be dealt with, and the positive actions can be further built on. So I would like to thank you for your attention. That's the end of my sort of brief presentation of our findings and such things.
Based on the recommendations that you have given, how would you assess the outcome of this election? What would be your assessment?
But we felt overall the election fell short of international standards, which was our reference point for our assessment.
And thank you very much for attending.